Well, hello folks, and welcome to episode 146 of Retro Power Uncut. And I forgot my coffee, but never mind, I've had it surgically removed. We're going to start with Project Churchill, the Mark II Jag Coupe, which is being worked on a double-pronged assault this week. Not entirely full-time on those prongs, but currently Stu is working on some of the underbody necessities, currently exhaust system. He's working out exactly the plan for the final routing of the exhaust so we can get things in place for that. I believe Cal has gone and ordered all the parts for that now. We had a little discussion, which is just after lunchtime now on Thursday. We had a little discussion just before lunch about exactly the final decisions on routing of the exhausts, whether to use a single pipe system or a twin pipe system. We're electing to use a twin pipe system, very similar to the system that Jag used originally on the X300 in terms of layout, XJ40 X300. Bear in mind the engine in this is effectively an X300 4-litre engine. We're using a very similar layout to that, with a bit of convolution around the back where it negotiates the rear axle assembly, because again, the long-term viewers will be aware that we fitted an S-type rear, independent rear suspension to this, as in the original S-type, not the later Lincolnified S-type. So we've got it's a deviation from the X300 in terms of the way the pipework will work around that. But we're basically going to be running a twin 2-inch system through most of the car, which is what Jaguar used on the highest output variants of the AJ16 in period, even with the supercharged setup. So it should be plenty enough for the engine that's in this. Bear in mind this is now going to be the normally aspirated, slightly breathed on, but not wildly modified, so that should be more than enough. And we think we've got a reasonable routing for that now worked out, where we've got clearance around all the pipes where we need it, and we're not going to overheat any bits of structure that we don't want to overheat, and it's all been reasonably well thought through, so that's done now. So Stu's going to be putting in any mountings that we need for hangers and doing some work on the rear valance in terms of clearance. We're doing some downswept tailpipes on this so that they're not particularly visible from the back, but we still need a little bit of clearance for them, so he's going to be doing that. The other area that Stu's been working on underneath is the handbrake. We're using a very similar setup to the original Mark II in terms of how the lever is, and the site where the lever is fitted between the seat and the sill. That's all very much sort of standard Mark II. Under the car, obviously with the IRS setup, we're deviating from the Mark II setup for the handbrake, and it's not only an IRS setup, but we've gone outboard brake IRS, so we're using the later type Jaguar IRS, so we've got further things to allow for there. So again, people familiar, I'm trying to always weigh up how much detail to go into on these things. Those familiar with the Jaguar Evolution will be aware that there's a little niche of sort of unique parts, which is the facelift Jaguar XJS, which uses an outboard brake version of the early type Jaguar XJ independent rear suspension, or not the XJ, just uses the early type IRS setup as fitted to E-types, S-types, Series XJ Jaguars, all of those, very similar setups. But it used the XJ40 hub carriers, drive shafts, not the lower arms, the hub carriers and drive shafts, and spindles and hub flanges and all the outboard parts and the brake assemblies as per the XJ40. And they did that by making some small modifications to the lower arms from the earlier setup and various other things I'm not going to go into all the detail of. But we're effectively using the narrower version of that setup on this car, using a hodgepodge of parts. Jaguar themselves on those facelift XJSs used sort of a hybrid handbrake mechanism, using a mixture of parts from the XJS, the earlier XJSs, and the XJ40, coupled with some modified parts of the earlier IRS setup, like the lower arm inner pivot pins were modified to have the handbrake mechanisms pivot on the front of them, so that they could pull XJ40, or very similar to XJ40 cables, and then they used a different cable forward of that going up to the lever. So we're using a mixture of standard Jaguar parts all the way from the lever right back to the wheels. So they're all off-the-shelf parts, albeit a mixture of them from various cars, to achieve the handbrake setup. The bit we need to make is a small section between the bell crank on the end of the lever, which is in the transmission tunnel on the Mark II Jaguar, and the forward end of the facelift XJS type handbrake cable, forward handbrake cable. So Stu's been making a little piece that goes in there, which will adapt those two pieces together basically, and allow the cable to hook into that adapter and be fitted. And from there back, all of the parts will be standard. We're just awaiting a 3/8 inch clevis to enable finishing of all that. In parallel with Stu doing that work, the other prong to the attack on Churchill is that Tom has been carrying on with the metal finishing work. This side of the car is broadly complete. Not completely complete, but broadly complete. The far side of the car is still undergoing. The quarter panel still has to be metal finished, and he's had quite an extensive amount of work to do on the door because we discovered a bit of an error. Errors are perhaps an exaggeration, but we found that the radius on the shoulder of the doors didn't match one side of the car to the other. Now the height of the doors doesn't match one side of the car to the other because it's as per Jaguar and the things were a bit all over the place. But we did want the car to have the same radius on the door both sides, so Tom's been fettling that, and it's become a little bit involved. But he's got that pretty darn close now. He's on the final work, just getting the tension right in the door skin for that side, and then he's going to move on to the quarter panel, get the quarter panel finished that side. And then the next phase after that, after a little bit of finessing of the boot lid, which I think I've mentioned before, is the front wings. And the front wings, the first step, I think I mentioned last week, is clay modelling on those. And we have the clay, we're in a position to get on with that. That just needs getting on with. But that's a job for Cal and or George, both of whom have been inordinately busy and haven't had a chance to get onto it. So early part of next week, doing some models of the front arches onto these wings just to work out a pleasing shape. It's very difficult to impose a new wheel arch shape into a Mark II Jaguar wing without making it look rubbish. So we've got to do some work there and come up with some ideas to make those arch flares look exactly correct. Once we've got that shape, Tom's next move will then be making those in steel and getting them grafted into those wings. That's where we're at on that. We'll march on then onto the Allegro Integra, oh no, that's dropped a clanger. Allegro Integra, Project Lucky Strike. It's very well timed wing falling over. We'll leave that, we're not using those. On camera right now is the inner wing reinforcer, which I think I mentioned last week, but it's really nicely on show there. Jamie's getting some good footage of it right there. Bobby's done some lovely work creating the boxes on the inner wings, which form all of the strength to replace the strength lost by removing some of the structure from the Honda Integra in that area. We've actually put back more structure than was removed in that location, so that's removed any issues in terms of strength there. And that all now ties beautifully back into the Allegro A-pillar and door hinge pillar structure. So that's all done now. We're really happy with that. Bobby's done this side as well. Obviously this side's covered up by a wing that I haven't put on the floor and knocked over. So that's all done. Rear seats are all mounted. I think we mentioned that. And then Bobby's moved on to getting the parcel shelf done. So we had a little bit of a to and fro on that. We had a decision on what speakers we wanted to fit to that, so we knew what space we needed for those, what shape they were going to be. Obviously the parcel shelf is revised in dimension in that it's the forward edge of it is actually slightly further forward. So the Integra seat, the rear seats actually sit slightly further forward. I mentioned last week about lack of rear leg room. We know that. It's chiefly going to be a two-seater. The rear seats are sort of emergency use seats really. It's not really planned for regular use, so that's not a major problem. They're in the same place as they would be in a Honda. They're on the Honda brackets. It's all entirely Honda, that structure. So the seats are literally just bolted onto the original Integra brackets. The difference in the floor plan is actually between the front of the rear seats and the back of the front seats. So it's basically just closed up the rear passenger footroom. But anyway, that's where they are. That's dictated the parcel shelf position. So we've removed the Allegro parcel shelf. Bobby's fabricated this new one. He's done that from sheet. This is 18 gauge, so 1.2mm approximately, cold rolled mild steel sheet. He has then drawn up, based on the dimensions of the loosely 6x9 speakers that are going in, he's drawn up a press tool which is made in 4mm thick hot rolled steel, cut on the CNC plasma cutter, made a little press tool with that in the fly press, and pressed these sections in to accommodate the speakers and give us a pleasing recess which will make it all look much neater once that's trimmed. That accommodates the cover grille for the speakers. It just will just look neat and tidy. Then he has cut out, he obviously prior to that cut out the blank for the panel. He's made an underneath reinforcer for the centre section, a top hat section box that sits underneath there that's chamfered to fit, blended to fit the tube at the front, under the front of the parcel shelf, tied into the reinforcers inside the C-pillars. There's a reinforcer channel that comes down inside the C-pillar, which Scott has tied into the inner wheel arches, both sides, via some new structure. That there's a piece of 1.5" 12 gauge tube run across between those C-pillar reinforcers, which supports the upper, just additionally supports the upper part of the rear seat. They're supported on the original Honda brackets. It gives additional support to that and provides a termination for the front of the parcel shelf. And that reinforcer ties into that. And then he's used the Pell's nibbler. Everybody calls it Pull Max. We refer to it as a Pull Max. It isn't a Pull Max. It's a Henry Pell's nibbler. It does the same job as a Pull Max. He's used that with one of the fluting tools that we've made previously for putting ribs into floor pans. He's used that to put the flutes into this parcel shelf. There's quite a bit of hand finishing needed after that. Every time you start and stop a flute with that tool, it involves quite a lot of handwork to make the ends look good. They basically look a mess as you form them. You wind the tool in, wind the tool out at each end. It pulls the material to the flute rather than completely stretching it, which means that you get bunching at the ends, which needs quite a lot of work. Shrinking at the ends to take out the distortion, and then hand hammer and dolly work around the ends to shape them and make them look sort of pleasing, and then quite a lot of fiddling around, basically getting distortion out of the panel and tidying it all up. It's not really a way around that unless you make a set of dies to restrain the panel so that the Pull Max tool is purely stretching the shape into the panel and not pulling the panel to the shape anymore, not causing shrink around it. I've seen that done, it's entirely possible, but for a one-off panel, it's not really viable to spend the time making that fixture just to achieve those reinforcements. It's better to just hand fettle the result afterwards. So that's what's been done there. Very pleasing, that's all in. Next steps on this are remove the quarter panels now and finish the sill structure at the back of the inner sills, which was inaccessible with the quarters on. Now we've got all the CAD data, George is progressing well with that. We can cut these quarters off, we don't need them anymore, so they're going. They'll be replaced by carbon. Following that, another step will then be working out an arrangement for the boot hinges, which we're revising for a couple of reasons, but we're revising the boot hinges, so that'll be one of the next steps after that. I'm going to pick this wing up because it's going to irritate me lying on the floor there. Hang that back on the car out of the way. Stick that back on there. There we go, put that out of the way. So the next vehicle in the pipeline is going to be, I'm going to let Jamie run around there, is the E-Type, Project Norman E-Type, which Sam has been busy working on continuing on the floor pan job. I think last week we talked about the inner sill reinforcement that had been done, the tube work that had been done down there, and all the gussets and reinforcements that had been put into it. And then I mentioned that he'd started work on narrowing the floor pan. I'm going to run around the other side of the car, I think. That'll work better. If I run around here. Hello! Yeah, Sam had just started, I think, narrowing the floor pan on the last video, I believe. He's now finished that work. He's hammered out the ends of the flutes in the floor. He's then used the air-powered shrinker to take the excess material that was gathered by those, that was created by the stretching in of those flutes originally on the press. It was done by the panel supplier, Martin Roby. He's then used the shrinker to take that stretch back out to get the floor pan levelled, and quite a lot of hammer and dolly work getting all of that flat. He's then modified put the notch into the side of the floor very neatly, created an angle section, TIG welded that into the side of the floor, dressed all the welds back, and got that all so that it's now a floor, a nice flat floor pan, but with the recess to allow for this step in the centre section. Got all of that done, and then he's got that all spot welded into the car. Last week, I think, again, we mentioned the fact that he'd split the floor pan at the back to enable the fitment of this rear section. He's got that rear section all fitted and all welded in place, and now he's got the front section TIG welded back onto it. Now it's in situ in the car. There's no way we could actually fit all of that floor pan in one piece, including all the reinforcement section at the back, without detaching the upper sections here, the rear seat sections in the back. We didn't really want to disturb all that structure because there's nothing wrong with it. All of the welds, all of the seams and everything are corrosion free there and all look perfect. We didn't really want to disturb all that. So rather than doing that, we split the floor as being the path of least resistance, quickest path, and path of least sort of evidence afterwards. It's literally just one line of TIG weld straight across the floor, dressed out. Looks perfectly neat, you never know it's been done, and it meant that the panel could be fitted in much quicker time. It's got all that in. He's now working on the footwell ends. We've decided to replace those because there was quite a lot of damage at the bottom edge. They needed re-edging anyway. It just makes more sense to just replace them. So he's got the footwell end out on the driver's side currently. That's been replaced with a new panel, as you can see there, which is cleaned up, got weld-through primer on all the edges of. He's also replaced the bracket that reinforces the front subframe attachment point on the edge of the footwell. Again, corroded and damaged originally, so easier when they're off the shelf, available from Martin Roby Limited, who are very, they're what, 4 miles away, 5 miles away from here, so close. Very helpful place, very helpful guys to deal with, and got those parts on the shelf in stock. No reason not to buy it. Far cheaper, far more effective for us to just go and buy the parts than try making them. So that reinforcer panel's fitted, that footwell end panel's about to be fitted. Then there's a little bit of structure to complete on the inner side, the transmission side of the bulkhead to floor joint, where we've got to add a bit of structure in there to box in the last part of the front subframe fitment there. And then at that point, with less a final few welds here and there, I think Sam is going to move on to the other side of the car, get that side to where this side is at now, and then do the outer sill replacements on both sides simultaneously, sort of back to back, once he's got the inners done both sides. So he's got all his measurements and visual references from this side to carry over to that side to make sure they're identical in terms of symmetry. It's just, it doesn't need to be, but we might as well do it that way, it makes sense. Pardon me. So I think that's pretty much where we're at on the E-Type. It's progressing well, moving forward nicely. I think then I'm going to swing briefly past the Integra. We'll just sort of walk round it, and that's about it. There's nothing really changed here. On this project, I'll gesticulate in the general direction of the Allegro. We're not going to go over to it, but the brown Allegro, which is over by the blast room, Rich has added in the reinforcements that we want to do on that. We've added a lot less reinforcement than we did on the first one. The second time round, we know what's going to go where. We've got datums for everything. So we're a bit less concerned with any slight flex in the body shell. So he's added a front windscreen brace, door aperture braces for the bottom of the door aperture, because we are going to have to remove the sills. He's added 2 bolt-in cross braces that go across those door aperture braces, a bolt-in diagonal brace at the B-pillar point, as I say, a bolt-in diagonal brace at the windscreen, and we're going to add a fixed X brace into the rear window aperture once we've blasted the window aperture. So into the early part of next week, we're literally going to use some black aerosol, satin black aerosol, to mark out the areas we need to blast on that body shell. We're not going to blast the whole shell, there's no point. We don't want to blast the roof, we're not using the quarters, we're not using the floor, we're not using the bulkhead, we're not using the engine bay, we're not using a lot of the boot. So the reality is we're only going to really blast the door apertures, the window apertures, the roof gutters, and various other selected parts before we start dissecting it. So we're just going to blast it selectively, unusually, for that one, because it's just not worth wasting the time and grit blasting all of the parts of the car that are going to be going away. I think we've had a couple of inquiries for panel sections from that car. Again, if anybody else needs any of the sections I've just mentioned that are being removed, mention it. I think the floor is already spoken for. But if anybody needs any other parts or the underpinnings of an Allegro, just mention it to us, because won't be being used. So that's where we're at with that. On this, you can see a few pen lines amongst other things going on. Now, we will be splitting this seam because of corrosion, but I can't shorten it there because, as you can see, the detail of this area doesn't lend itself to being shortened by 130 millimeters. However, the detail in this area does lend itself to being shortened. So what we do is we detach along this seam, we shorten the sill by 130 mil here and put it back into this same configuration as per there, but 130 mil forward, so about here, the same configuration as that. We slide this joint along after we unpick the spot welds. We remove 130 mil from this section where the two halves are parallel so that we can join those, TIG, butt weld that back together, panel beat it, and then there'll be an invisible join line put back there. We're going to follow this line around here basically, drill these spot welds out, then we can remove this upper skin. This section is double skin. There's an underneath transmission tunnel and a top transmission tunnel, and there are two chassis rails that run underneath here. We'll remove that. That gives us access to the underneath structure here. The underneath structure, these two chassis rails have a section roughly there where they're exactly parallel. So I can remove 130 millimeters from those rails in that area, remove this top section, remove 130 mil from this sub-tunnel in that area, do these various other sectionings of the floor, then slide the car back together, repair weld the floor pan each side, rejoin the sill in exactly the same fashion as it was joined originally, rejoin the rails under there in the fashion that they were joined originally, and once all that's done, put this upper section back, again having shortened it, put this upper section back. So that's about where we're at on the Integra. Other than that, the structure's all removed that needs to be removed. We've then got to add in further structure as per the previous car, and that's what Scott will be moving on to very shortly, although he's picking up some other jobs that I think Cal's going to mention on the assembly side, so I won't go into those. Moving on, there are a couple of questions that I've seen crop up a few times, and I've seen people speculating on answers to them, so I thought I'd just fill in on them. Pardon if my apologies if Cal has already answered these before, but I don't think he has. I'd seen a few times, it was relating to the other Allegro, people questioning about the coating of internal surfaces, and that we had mentioned using an epoxy primer, and I saw somebody questioning whether we had or not. Yeah, we generally, where we have access, if we're creating a hollow section, we will coat that with a high zinc, anti-corrosion, epoxy high build primer, which is a Celimix product. At some point I'm going to be organised and have it written down on a bit of note in front of me what it is. The Celimix products aren't, their codes are just a sequence of numbers and full stops, so it's not the most memorable thing for me to remember off the top of my head, but it's just a multi-digit number. But I can get that, I'll supply that on a future episode, but it's a Celimix product aimed at the marine market that we use. We use that for pretty much all of our epoxy priming at every stage that we do it on body shells. So what we do is either spray or brush that onto the sections before we assemble them. Now obviously we can't use that on welded seams because it burns off. Well, it actually prevents them welding. So what we do is we use a weld-through primer, which, if you wait there a minute, I will grab. I should have a tin of it, yeah. We use a Pro XL product, Pro XL Weld. It's as technical as that. We found that to be a particularly good weld-through primer. U-POL do a very similar product. I would go so far as to saying they're basically identical. U-POL do a very similar product, which we've used in the past as well. We find the Pro XL stuff really good, so we use that on all the seams that have got to be spot welded or welded in some means after coating. We'll use that. Anywhere where no welds have to be done, we'll use the anti-corrosion epoxy. Obviously that doesn't coat sections that are hollow sections that haven't been opened up. And I've seen a question on this one. On those, it's a very simple answer. We wax inject them once the car is done. There is nothing else that can really be done. It's 100%. Even that's not 100%. There is nothing else that gives 100% sort of certainty of anti-corrosion inside those hollow sections. But we just choose to wax inject after final paint. Then we can satisfy ourselves that we've coated all of the hollow sections to the best of our ability, and then it's not relying on somebody else's process that we don't have any control over, and we have no direct detailed understanding of the exact path that vehicle went down. So that's why we do what we do there. The other question I'm going to get onto quickly, because I realise I'm going on tangents, is tools. Had a few questions about tools and about what we use, and I saw somebody correctly saying, oh yeah, lots of Milwaukee stuff there. Yeah, we've gravitated, probably driven by a couple of us, towards Milwaukee cordless equipment for a lot of things we do in the workshop. Key things we use in fabrication workshop: cordless drill, Milwaukee FPD2, I think Stu's just got an FPD3, really good bit of kit, use those. A Milwaukee cordless angle die grinder fitted with roll-lock backing pads for doing weld dressing, again really useful. Absolutely indispensable bit of kit. I made one myself, and as a lot of people have, and then Milwaukee early this year brought out their own, which is really good. Brushless belt sander for a 10mm belt, absolutely brilliant, completely indispensable bit of equipment. And then last but not least, and probably the most used on a lot of the fabrication work, again, cordless angle grinder. That is a substitute for a 240 volt mains one, no question. I never use a mains one now, there's no point. That compares with a 650 watt mains powered angle grinder all the time, no problem at all. So that's all, we don't bother with the mains one now really, we just don't use them. And then there's other bits of kit, cordless riveters, useful thing, and obviously impact guns and things, not really relevant to fabrication. Then the other side of things, a couple of good old British made bits of kit. Senga saws, these are made up in Halifax I believe. Yeah, Senga Universal Tool Company in Halifax, still going, supply the fire brigade with a lot of kit I believe. Still going, ring them up if you need a spare part, they'll supply the spare part, absolutely brilliant. Those air saws, JP 901 air saw, it is built like a tank. The Chinese junk air saws are literally not worth wasting your money on. These things, just absolutely indestructible, cut anything. And then they do a slower version for a longer stroke, which is good for actually cutting up structural stuff on cars. Can't remember the model on that one now, but it's a slower running, longer stroke Senga saw which you use. And then air chisel, long stroke Chicago pneumatic air chisel, good for breaking spot welds. And then various like D'Souza angle die grinder, which I don't really use much anymore. Dynabrade one, D'Souza one, really good bits of kit, but we don't really use them anymore. That's probably covered the bulk of things in there. But I noticed a few people asking about what bits of kit we use. We're not sponsored by anybody for anything like that. Obviously it'd be very nice if we were, but we're not sponsored by anybody. It's just that this stuff absolutely kicks the ass of pretty much anything else. So that's why we use it. I'm sure there are other things, but none of the ones I've used compare to it. So that's why we've kind of settled on that. Moving on, right from my little sidetrack lecture there, the Escort is in the paint booth. The guys have been working on that. Tom's been doing a few little bits of metal tweaking, getting the wings ready to fit, and we had to do a little bit of tweaking on the doors as well, just getting the wings to fit. So he's been getting that all ready and aligned and set. Now Gaz is doing the Raptor on the inner wing and under the outer wing areas that are inaccessible once the wings are welded on, having masked up the areas where the welds have got to be put, so that then tomorrow they can get Tom can start work on getting the front wings welded onto the shell, so that then the guys can get on with the body prep work, basically on the doors and wings and all the front end of the car. They're getting pretty close on the rest of it. They need to do the doors, wings and the front end. So that's been going on. And then obviously otherwise in the body shop, lots of other side jobs. Now assembly starting on the first Escort. Then there's various bits of final paint work. Radiators, for example, are getting painted. Scott's just been pressure testing those. They're getting painted. There's various other bits of work going on to do with the assembly. But at that point, I think it's a good time to hand over to Cal before I bore you all to death. So, right, until next week. See you then.
Thank you, Nat. We're starting in the office on this occasion, and I'm doing something I do quite a lot, which is going through lots of colour samples. And this is probably something we've never really shown much behind the scenes stuff on before. But there's always, when it comes to exterior colours, interior colours, all of the detail, there's always so much thought, and it kind of starts obviously with discussions with the client, and then it's kind of interpreting their ideas, and there are so many little design decisions to make, throughout the whole build of a car. And that often sort of surprises people, is that although we obviously get an overview from the client, for every one major decision, there's probably 1,000 tiny decisions, just down to, you know, the colour of plating on fasteners and that sort of thing. So at the moment, I'm going through the accent colours on the Escort, so the Project 1 Escort, the one that's a sort of blue-grey. We wanted to do some details in a sort of bronzy colour, including the wheels. Now, some of those components are going to be sort of regularly touched components, like the door handles as an example, where I don't really want to use a painted finish. So we want to be able to anodise those parts. So there'll be quite a few anodised parts, things like the door handles. There are details on the wing mirrors that are going to have that accent. The bezels around the instruments are going to have that accent colour. So I want to find an anodised finish, but also there are going to be some painted parts, like the wheels, for example. So I want a paint finish that we can match very closely with an anodised finish. So basically the process there has started with choosing a colour that was pretty close to what we wanted, a kind of bronzy colour. Supplied that to Majestic Anodising, they're not our usual anodisers, but they can offer a much wider range of colours compared to our usual one. Get them to do the closest anodising colour they can do to that paint sample, which I've now got. So these were just some scrap disc bells we had, and some other parts as well. We wanted to use the actual grade of aluminium that we're going to be using on the final part. So we know this is 6082 because we had these made. So we know the finish is going to be exactly the same as this. And then now I've got those back, I'm going through our colour sample library, which is quite vast actually. I'd never looked at how many there are, but there's 5 colours on each of these strips. I'm guessing there's probably a couple of hundred of those in one of these. There's 18 of those in one of those boxes, and I've got 4 of those boxes, so quite a lot of colour samples. So I'm just going through those now, trying to identify a colour that's as close as possible. Now the only downside is these are glossy samples, and the gloss level changes the tone slightly. So what I'm going to do is choose a couple of colours I think pretty close. We'll then do some spray out speed shapes like this in the colours that I've chosen, but with a matte lacquer on them, and get as close as we can to this anodised finish. So then we can anodise all the accent sort of aluminium parts in this finish, and then the parts that are going to be painted, like the wheels, and there's a few other components that are going to be painted as well, can be a painted finish that's extremely close. So yeah, watch this space on that taking shape. And also on the desk here I've got the handbrake surround piece, which Dean's been leathering. So that's done. This little 3D printed piece is going to be a machined piece, which I think is actually arriving tomorrow, so we might get some footage of that on here. And then there's basically like a little brush type, almost draft excluded brush thing here, and the handbrake lever pokes through here. So now that's leathered, and that machine bit's going to be done. We'll get that anodised and that'll be ready to go in. Which I think is actually the last piece of the Morris interior puzzle. Right, so that's that. Follow me this way. We'll do a little loop through. Maybe if you go over there near the Stratos. So I'll start with the Camaro. James, very proudly gesturing as we walked over. James is doing the exhaust system on this. I think it's only in the early stages at the minute, but just working his way through it. Not much more to elaborate on that. It's going to be, I think is it 3-inch stainless? Twin 3-inch stainless system. We've got 2 oval boxes, which have got a diagonal crossover to kind of get from the position quite near the prop, where we're tucking them up a little bit for ground clearance, to an outboard position to go over the axle, and then that's it in terms of silencing. So it's going to be on the fruitier end of the scale, I would say. Hopefully not too loud, but to be fair, space on this for exhaust silencers without compromising the ground clearance is not abundant, and ultimately, who wants a quiet Camaro? So that's where we're at with that, and I think there's a few bits coming back from machining. The grille badge I think has been machined, so might be able to drop a bit of footage of that in now, because I think that'll be here tomorrow. And I've got a few more bits on order. The central Chevy badge for the grills on order, and then I think the reservoir is going to be machined very shortly. The screen wash fill / clutch reservoir for the engine bay. and might even, I think the bonnet pin bezels may have been machined as well now. They're certainly on the brink of being machined, so basically edging forward with that. So that's where we're at with that. Conveniently, right in front of me, so I can talk about this, is the dummy engine for the Project 1 Escort, or for both of the Mark 1 Escorts. Now we're running these with a Mazda MX-5 gearbox. This is a retro forward adapter plate, and because of the difference in the mounting of the starter versus a BD, we need to have custom flywheels made for these, one of which is in this box. So TTV have done these for us. They generally do all of our custom flywheel builds, quite a lot of our clutch stuff as well. I can't actually get my fingers underneath this to show you, but the main difference is that the ring gear on a BD sits a lot further away from the block. So basically, this obviously is hollow, it's not solid, don't be frightened by the thickness looking from the side, but it's basically to offset the ring gear closer to the block so that we can use a normal starter motor from a Z-Tech, which will then have the right spacing. So before I send this to Sherwood, along with the clutch, which is with it here, we wanted to mock up everything on here, so consequently Anthony's been getting the MX-5 gearbox out, trial fitting everything, measuring everything. He's also just doing the modification that's required at the moment on the gearbox, which is on the input shaft seal housing. There's like an elongated trumpet, which is where the normal mechanical clutch runs. We swap them over to running a hydraulic concentric release that sits in there, so you actually have to machine that off. In fact, I think James has already done it. Yes, he has. So James has just been machining off that central spigot, so that's not in our way, and we can just double check the clearance for the clutch release. But it's, at the moment, it's all looking good, so I can get that flywheel and the clutch over to Sherwood, which means he can finish the engine builds on the final engines. Carrying on the subject of Project 1, we're basically getting everything ready to get it rolling. So the subframe's built and is down there. Anthony's finished assembling the drive shafts. The diff's all built up with its brackets, and that's now ready to go into the subframe. I'm just waiting, I think I said this last week, I'm just waiting for the struts back from Nitron. Now they've re-lengthed the hoses for the remote reservoirs. I think I'll be able to pick them up tomorrow. So I would say, all being well, next week, we should probably be in a position to have that rolling, and that probably ties in with why I was talking about the colours at the start, is because we want to get the wheels painted. Mark's already got them prepped and ready to go. I've just got to give him the final colour, and then we can get the wheels painted, tyres on, and then I think we've got everything to totally get it together and rolling. And then Anthony's been chipping away at various other jobs on that, so things like the screen wash jets, or I say the screen wash jets, they're actually the spigots that pass the screen wash through the scuttle. So what we're doing is we're having washer jets on the wiper arms. So there'll be a hose running down the wiper arm, and then when Bobby did the metalwork, he did a little integrated threaded boss in the scuttle, and then made some really nice little stainless steel kind of buttressed sort of spigots that go thread into that, and then the pipes will go onto those, and then the one on the removable scuttle panel also actually clamps the scuttle panel down, and it's got a sealing washer under it as well. And then I think that scuttle panel itself is bolted down. We've got some wax oil in that heater intake area. Although actually, because we basically cut the inside of that out and put a bolt-in panel so you can access in there fairly well for the prep and paint stage. So it was well painted in there anyway, but belt and braces got wax oil in there. And then Anthony's been going over and wax oiling everything else. We always wait until we've done the dynamat before we do that, because you tend to find that the mist of wax oil can make it hard for the dynamat to stick in some places. So all the hollow sections now have been wax oiled, and we're ready to start the build. So I think next week that'll be moved over onto the ramp. We'll get the subframes in, hopefully you have the wheels ready to go at that point, and yeah, get it rolling, start moving forward with other stuff. Things like handbrake assemblies just being stripped, and so we can replate and repaint the parts. Lots of other bits are already kind of stacking up on the shelves, ready to go on, and the guys are just buttoning up a lot of the design work jobs that were still outstanding on it. But we're getting pretty well through those now, so I don't think there's too much left in terms of bespoke parts. So that's where we're at with that. Morris, I've obviously just received that part back, which kind of is the remaining part on the interior. Now I've just got to get out and get some more miles on this now. I think I said last week I'm happy with how it all drives now. I was just waiting for that bit. I kind of wanted to have the handbrake in and assembled, because you need that leather surround to actually get the handbrake lever bolted in. It goes in at the same time. And although I've done some test driving in it, before I get too spirited in my driving, I kind of fancied having an emergency brake. So I'm going to get that in and get the handbrake done, and then I'll go out and get some more miles on that, which I'm really looking forward to. I enjoy driving that thing, so getting some miles on and yeah, working towards handing it over. And actually, that's just reminded me of one last thing. The little guides, we revised the guides that the seatbelt comes through on the sides of the seat. The original design actually meant that seat belts went a bit tight as you pulled them. So we've tweaked that design. Those have been machined by, and I'm going to have to put a little subtitle in here because I can't remember his name. I think the guy's name is Jonathan Plumridge. He introduced, can't remember the company name, but he introduced himself a little while back to me. He said maybe I could take on some of your machining work, and we've got an ever-growing stack of machining. And while Andy Concept 303 is extremely good and continues to be, top-notch to deal with, he's only got a 3-axis, and some of the parts are quite complicated and demand a 5-axis machine. And so perhaps if we're happy with the results, Jonathan may well become one of our go-to machinists. So watch this space on that. So that's that. Land Cruiser, James has been working on the airbox. It's just over here actually. I think I mentioned it last week because we'd come up with a solution. We wanted something old school looking, pancake filter style, so I haven't got the top of this, but basically there's a flat top on this with a nut in the middle. Good old fashioned pancake filter goes in there. The detail on the bottom wasn't right, but we already had an Edelbrock filter that fitted our throttle body and had the right depth to clear all the throttle linkage. So we basically cut the two apart, spot welded down here, and that just left a couple of remaining tweaks, one of which was to extend this spigot. Now James has got this ring pushed on here ready to go, but we just wanted to do a couple more checks with the breather plumbing in before we determine exactly what height to make that, and the breather plumbing spigot. So he's made this little stainless steel T spigot here, which will have branches out to each of the rocker covers or cam covers for the breathers. As soon as we've determined the height for that, we'll weld that in, seal it all up. That'll be painted satin black, and that'll be ready to go in. And at that point, yes, I will definitely be driving that. So looking forward to that as well. I've got lots of test driving jobs on the cards. Speaking of satin black, the radiators for Project 1, Mark 1 Escort. So we had one last job to do on them, which I'm trying to remember what it was. Oh, the fan brackets, that was it. So we got those. They were actually an off-the-shelf radiator, which we've done some modifications to. They're a BDA Mark 1 Escort radiator. We've modified the bottom with a machine flange and a bolt-in piece that actually bolts a water to oil heat exchanger into the bottom of the radiator. So that's our oil cooling. But we also wanted to do our own fan brackets on there on the back. So we've now got the fan. We've got basically the biggest, most powerful fan from Spal, who we always use for fans, that will fit in the space. And then Scott's just been welding up the brackets for that. So now that's done, they can be painted satin black, which was the link to this, and they'll be ready to go in. So it's kind of, we've got loads of things all coming to fruition for the Escort build. I think on that, I might just mention Utah. A couple of things on that. We sorted the oil pressure gauge. Another gremlin on it was that the fuel level gauge didn't seem right. It seemed to misread. I got to the bottom of what that was. We use a little gadget that translates basically any fuel level signal to any gauge, and you can calibrate the two, and it also has an anti-slosh feature, so if the level's fluctuating a lot, it just dampens the movement of the needle down. However, I don't think there's any inbuilt voltage regulation on those, because I think when we set it up, it would have been set up with the engine not running, maybe even with the battery a bit low. And it turns out that when the engine's running and it's charging nicely, it overread a fair amount. So I've just recalibrated that with the engine running. Also took the opportunity to just have a little tweak of the balance on the throttle bodies, because I thought it was just sounding a tiny little bit offbeat. The client hadn't mentioned it, but it didn't sound quite as smooth as it once did, and sure enough, a couple of the runners were just slightly out of balance, so I've just tweaked the air bleeds on those to get that smooth, and it's amazing how how much of a difference it makes to the sound of the engine at idle. Particularly, they kind of sound a bit offbeat when there's only the slightest difference in airflow. So I sorted that. I've just got to put the airbox back on. Also took the opportunity to take the driver's seat apart. Last week I showed we bypassed the pressure switch on the heating element on the passenger seat. The client hadn't mentioned anything about the driver's seat heat not working. In fact, he said it was working, but I noticed it was drawing significantly less current than it should be. So I suspect there was an intermittent fault with the pressure switch on that one as well. So I've bypassed it on the other seat. So basically we've now, instead of having any pressure sensors so they only heat when you're sitting on them, they come on whenever the switches are on, but there's a 10-minute timer on them. So if you leave the heated seats on, after 10 minutes they go off and you have to just toggle the switches off and on again if you want them on for longer than that. So yeah, we're about ready to hand that back over. So that should be going back next week. And speaking of next week, I will see you then. Smooth.